Uh, he is the vice president of the Battle Creek Beekeeping Association. Is that right as well? We're
Yep,
good.
Battle Creek Beekeepers Club. That's us. Yep.
Beekeepers Club, yes. And he will be giving a presentation on honeybees and bumblebees, as well as showing a surprise at the end. Okay,
Oh yeah.
Ryan, here you go.
Thank you, Jade, and thank you, Willowwood Library, for having me. I'm actually sitting here under a shade tree to try to keep cool. It's about 92 degrees in the apiary right now. So what I want to do is just quickly run through a slideshow presentation through Michigan State University Extension. I feel that's pretty important, and to talk a little bit about our native pollinators. I won't try to be too long-winded with that, and then I'd like to take you all live in my bee yard and show you a little bit about beekeeping. So hope you all are excited. I have my friend Val here with me. She's going to be running the camera. Val is one that I actually brought into beekeeping, a little peer pressure, but she's managing her hives now, and she's taught me a lot about foraging. So we kind of exchange information. So yeah, Jade, if you want to bring up the slideshow, I can go through that, and then we'll get started in the bee yard. Okay, can everybody see me or just hear me? Oh, here we go. Okay. So pollinators, this is, again, it's a course through Michigan State University Extension. They are a wealth of knowledge when it comes to beekeeping, native pollinators, and all kinds of stuff. Even if you wanted to go on and look at, what's in bloom this time of year, it's an excellent resource. So anybody that's even thinking about getting into beekeeping, definitely would recommend that. So let's get started. Pollinators are very important. In this talk, we'll talk about the pollination process, why pollination is important, who are the pollinators, and what is happening to our pollinators. And more importantly, what can you do to help our pollinators? Plants can't move the pollen by themselves, so they have to find an insect or something to move the pollen for them. This process has been going on for millions of years. Okay, next slide. There are different types of pollination. When you think of something like corn, which we have a lot of in Michigan, that is really no help to our bees. That's actually pollinated through wind pollination. Right here, what we're talking about is animal-mediated pollination, where a bee or an insect would take pollen from the male parts of the flower, transport it, and then to the female parts of the flower. Okay, next slide. And this is just a quick chart of the whole fertilization process, and that's what gives us our fruit. Next slide. Yep, and during the fertilization process, the ovaries swell, animal eats the fruit, moves the seeds around, and that's how things grow. Next slide, please. This is just a quick little demonstration of what happens when something is poorly pollinated, as you can see with the raspberries. Okay, next slide. Another picture, I believe that's Whole Foods. This is what your produce section would look like with, without, and with pollinators. Okay, next slide. We care about the pollinators because they pollinate our food crops. Over 90 crops in the United States are dependent on pollinators. So if you grow a garden or have fruit trees on your property, keeping bees or keeping your native pollinators happy is definitely beneficial. Okay, next slide. Around 80% of all flowering plants need animal pollinators. The plants that need pollinators are important for our ecosystem to function. Next slide. The pollinators keep ecosystems healthy. And you can see the graph there. It's kind of small on my screen. At the top, we have the carnivores, herbivores, all the way down to decomposers. Go ahead, next slide, please. Meet the pollinators. We have an amazing diversity of pollinators, and there are around 200,000 different species of animals that act as pollinators in the world. We will talk about these in three groups: the honeybees, the native bees, and maybe other pollinators that you just haven't even thought about. Next, please. First off, the honeybees. These people are usually most familiar with. They live in large colonies. They can be managed. The Western European, I guess the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, is a honeybee that we manage here in the United States. But you have to remember that Apis mellifera, the European honeybee, was imported. It is not native here. Beekeeping has been around for over 9,000 years. Next, please. Most of our food that is pollinated by honeybees are managed by commercial beekeepers. These beekeepers can manage thousands of hives and move them around the country, and place bees near the crops when it is time for them to be pollinated. And just one quick thing on that. What I do in my bee yard, I'm kind of considered a hobbyist beekeeper. There's three different categories. There's the hobbyist, which again does that in their own backyard. There's a sideliner, which is somebody who manages bees, but still has like a 9 to 5 job. And then there's the commercial beekeeper who has a very large scale operation, and that's their livelihood. That's what they do. So, next slide, please. Okay, so this slide is just showing the steps of, kind of what happens if you are a commercial beekeeper. The beekeeper trucks the bees to the yard. He sets the hives up before or at the right time for pollination. After the bloom, the beekeeper removes them, places them back on the truck, and then trucks them elsewhere. Next slide, please. The honeybee is a very hard worker. They pollinate much of our food and produce delicious honey. Next slide. But like I mentioned before, we have lots of other pollinators in Michigan. I believe it's one of the next slides here. We have around, I believe, 465 different native pollinators in Michigan. Everything from masonry bees, leafcutter bees, even little sweat bees are pollinators. Hummingbirds, they're pollinators. So we have a lot of different pollinators in a very diverse habitat here in Michigan. Next, please. And there you have a picture of some of our native bees. Now, I haven't memorized all of them, but I know a few of them. And some things you can do to help them is putting up a bee house, a native bee house. And I think I have one later I can show during the demonstration. Next, please. Some plant pollinator relationships are very specific, like the squash bee here. I actually saw one last year on my zucchini plants, and that's strictly all that they pollinate. And then there are other plant pollinator relationships that are very general, like a bumblebee that will pollinate many different types of plants. Next. With the native bees, not all bees live in a large colony and make honey. A lot of them are solitary, like this masonry bee. The female builds a nest by herself and nest in the ground. A lot of other native bees will nest in hollow stems, cavities, your old wood pile, or even old rodent nest. Next. Okay, other pollinators include Wasps, flies, butterflies, moths, beetles, bats. That's surprising. Some birds, some primates, some rodents, and a few lizards. Next. So, what is happening to our pollinators? Bees have been in the news a lot lately, and there's a term called colony collapse disorder, and we're going to explore that a little more here in a few minutes. What's happening to our bee, not just our honeybee populations, but the native bees. Honeybees aren't going extinct, but they do face a lot of many challenges, and it does make it tough for a beekeeper at times. Again, same thing with the native bees. Native bees, like the rusty patched bumblebee, have declined 87% in the past 20 years. That's staggering. Next. So some of the major factors for pollinators include, that affect pollinators include, I call it the 3 Ps. Go ahead and click on the next. Pests and pathogens like the varroa mite. That's our biggest threat to our honeybees, in my opinion. Poor nutrition, monoculture, actually the common yard that doesn't have a lot of clover, things to forage on, and then pesticides. So there you have it, the 3 Ps. Next. Oop. Okay. The entire diet of a bee is from the flowers. If there are no flowers, there are no food for bees and other pollinators. Next. Humans reduce the number of flowers in the landscape. Look at that nice manicured lawn. In just a minute, you'll get to see my not so nice manicured lawn. I have lots of clover and lots of wildflowers on my property. And then big agriculture. Again, going back to the corn, really not any huge benefit to our honeybees because corn is pollinated by the wind. Okay, next. We're constantly changing landscapes, more development, more concrete, more cement, more homes, and that's destroying a lot of the native habitat. Next. Again, pests and pathogens. Go ahead and click the next slide, please. We move bees around. Again, going back to that commercial beekeeper, we move bees around for pollination, and that's how a lot of times pests and pathogens are spread, is through that process. It was up until I think the mid 1980s we really started to see an increase in varroa mites through migratory beekeeping. And then ever since then, it's been a problem for our beekeepers. Next. Here's a good picture of what a varroa mite looks like. Varroa mites are parasites. They're actually introduced to the western honeybee, Apis mellifera, which we just talked about, from the Asian honeybee, Apis cerana. And actually, interestingly enough, Apis cerana, I believe, is starting to build up a little more tolerance to varroa mites. And that's our hope in the future, is that our bees, the European honeybee and what we manage here in the United States, we're starting to build up more of a tolerance. And there's actually breeding taking place and for genetics to try to manage these pests. The varroa mite can just devastate the western honeybee hives. They transmit, I believe it's somewhere around 20 some different viruses. So they're a big nuisance. They live under the brood cappings, and they attach themselves. You can see the one on the top picture. It's attached itself to the pupa of the honeybee. And then if you ever get to this stage, which is the bottom picture where you're starting to see them visible on your honeybees, they're usually already way too infested. And as a beekeeper, we need to know what is the threshold and then decide if and how we want to treat them. Next. Oh boy, and then pesticides. This is I think there's usually a big misconception about the pesticides. They are damaging, but a lot of times they're not immediately lethal. And when you look at the slide here, looking at herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, antibiotics, repellents, there's all kinds of stuff that our honeybees come in contact with. And normally it's not an immediate killer, but it is something that can affect the health of our bees. Next. Pollinators come in contact with these chemicals in many places, on the flowers where they forage, and the pollen they bring back to the hive, and that's how it's transmitted. And I'm going to talk a lot later on what you as the average landowner or homeowner can do, that if you do want to use pesticides or herbicides, definitely follow those labels and maybe some tricks on when to apply, so you don't affect your pollinators. Next, please. Okay. And again, we talked about the effects on the pollinators. Sometimes it can be directly lethal, and kill right on contact. Next, please. It can be sublethal. It'll impair the bees' normal behavior and their reproduction. Again, it will kill them, but it'll just be a lot slower. And then sometimes it may be more neutral, having little to no effect at all on the honeybee's health. Next. So you can see that those three major stress factors are what is causing our honeybee decline and what we would term as colony collapse disorder. So those are probably the three biggest major stressors. Next. This is just an example of interacting factors. Poor nutrition makes it difficult for bees to detoxify pesticides, or fight off the infectious diseases. So again, sublethal effects of pesticides make it more difficult to forage for the food. Next, please. So what can we do? Reduce the exposure to pesticides, plant more flowers, and promote pollinator health through policy and research.
Don't mow your dandelions.
Don't mow your dandelions.
Don't mow your clover.
Yeah. Establish a pollinator lawn. Okay, next slide. Yeah, other ways to help pollinators, like Val said. When I first moved to my property, and I own 6 acres here, I would have one of the neighbors come over and just completely knock down all of the goldenrod in the fall. I had this misconception that I was convinced that was causing my allergies. But then I read up on it and I learned that the pollen granules of um, goldenrod are actually kind of sticky, and they really don't get as airborne as the other type of allergy irritant that comes up this time of year, and that time of year, and that's ragweed. So goldenrod is a good thing, and I'm happy to report that ever since I found that out, I have fields and fields of goldenrod around here. Next slide, please. Again, going back to the pesticides and the herbicides, read your labels, use the minimum amount necessary. I think a lot of times there's just a lot of overkill and overspray. Take those preventative measures, and I'm going to talk a little more in depth about this later on. But apply it at night when the bees are less active, or apply it at a time when maybe the plants aren't flowering, and your native bees and your honeybees are going to be a lot less likely to come in contact with those herbicides and pesticides. Yep, and that's exactly what I just hit on. So we'll go to the next slide. Yep, read the label, use the directed amount, and make sure that even if the label doesn't say, just assume. Let's see, you cannot assume that it's be safe. So again, just take caution with applying those things. Okay, next. Plant more flowers. Plant trees. More importantly, plant trees, because those trees, flowers will last, but trees will probably be here longer than you and I will. So trees are also important. Next. Pollinator gardens. Find a spot on your property, even if it's a small property, a 10 by 10 patch. There are tons of resources out there on seed mixes. And even if you want to do a larger plot, there is there are some government programs out there that you can look into that could help you out with the cost. Next. Yep, and pollinator lawns, we've talked about that. Pollinator supportive trees, the American basswood, which is on, we are actually on a basswood flow right now. Maples and willows early in the spring. Tulip trees, dogwood, common choke cherry, black cherry. These are just to name a few. There are a lot of resources online that that won't only tell you, what are good flowering trees, but when are they flowering and when are your nectar flows. So as a beekeeper, we pay close attention to that. Next. Okay, next. Yep, do what you can, where you can. And again, I'm going to talk a lot about this a little bit towards the end of the session. Trying not to get too long-winded about it, but I definitely think I can offer some tips for the average landowner or homeowner to help our bee populations. Next. So for more information, this course I took was about 3 to 4 hours, and it is a lot more in depth than what I just presented to you. It is through Michigan State University Extension, and there is the address. I encourage anyone who wants to become a beekeeper or who is interested in native pollinators to check that website out, because there is a lot of good information there. Okay, and I think that's the conclusion of the slideshow. Can everybody still see me? I'm going to brave and come out of the shade now. Val's going to get the camera set up, and we're going to head over here and go live in the bee yard. Okay. Pretty sure we're still live.
Okay, so I want to flip this the other way. How do I flip it? I need to flip it. It's got me.
Gosh, it looks like, look how active those hives are. Okay, can everybody see me here? Jade, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
All right. Sorry if I made everybody dizzy there for a minute. We're just trying to get the camera set up. So this is my bee yard in Marshall. And this is what you can expect on a hot 92-degree day on July 8th. Currently in this apiary, or in this bee yard, I'm managing 12 hives. Actually 13 if you count this little guy here. But the bees are super active. I hope you all can see the different flight paths of all the bees coming and going. It's just amazing. Everything's abuzz. Okay, so we're going to try to get the camera set up here, and I'll try to stay on task. We're going to start with showing everybody what's the basic equipment for somebody who would want to get into beekeeping, and then I think we'll dive into a couple of the hives. I'm not going to wear a suit because it's super hot out, so I'm going to go kind of with the minimum amount of stuff necessary here, but I'm trying not to get too long-winded. So here we go. Can we flip it? I don't know. No, I don't think so. No. Okay.
All right. I'm going to see if I can flip this here while Ryan's getting suited. Apparently we can't. So I'm not going to be able to see what they're seeing.
Is Jade still there?
Jade, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay. Do you know? Is there any way to change our view on the on the screen? We're kind of on the selfie mode here.
Can you repeat that? Okay, because right now I see you.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we'll be able to do it, Val. Okay. Sorry, I had to get a close up. Anyway, I guess we can quickly talk about personal protective equipment since I have my sun helmet on here. I got my COVID haircut here. But it's keeping the sun off my head, and it's actually part of my veil. So anyone who's thinking about getting into beekeeping, I would say at minimum, you're going to need a good veil. Over here, hive tool, and the smoker. Those are the three must. Anyone who wants to get into beekeeping and they don't feel comfortable with that, I definitely encourage you to get a suit. And that's kind of like what Val is wearing here.
I can monitor from my phone what we're seeing on there.
Oh, do we want to switch?
No, I mean, just let me hold that, but I can see.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I can look at two phones to see
Perfect.
the picture I'm getting. Yeah. Okay.
So we're going to start right here.
Oh, there's a delay is the problem. There we go.
You got it?
Yeah, the
If you
problem.
want to stand back a little bit, I'll start talking about that.
Okay.
Okay, so again, what is your basic equipment setup? And if I'm going to start from the bottom, and as you saw in my bee yard, what I did is I laid down some landscape fabric and then some wood mulch, just to keep the weeds down because the bees aren't real happy when you start weed whacking and vibrating around the hives. So that's my method. You see a lot of the hives are set up on cinder blocks or treated 4x4s. And I'm going to then at that stage, once you get the hive off the ground, and you can even set them down on a pallet just like this. And this is what a lot of those commercial beekeepers will do. So I'm going to start from the ground up. This is what we call a bottom board. And this particular one is a screen bottom board. And then on top of that, we would put what we call a deep box. Now, a deep box is where all of the brood life happens, all of the stages, from the egg to the larva to the pupa of the honeybee. And then on top of that, again, a common configuration here in Michigan is to add a second deep box. Okay, and in each of these deep boxes, you're going to have 10 frames. Each frame has a foundation, pine wood foundation, and that's where the bees will draw out all of the wax in the comb. In early spring, when you get your bees, and I guess I should back up just a little bit, our season here in Michigan is probably from about mid to late April through October, November. So not a real long season, not like the folks down south. So in April, if you're looking to get started for bees, you can buy a nucleus of bees, which will come in a box like this. Okay. This is kind of like a corrugated cardboard box. And that's going to have your queen, the worker bees, and all the different life stages, the eggs, the larva, and the pupa. So when you would install that, again, it's probably late April or May, you come out to your hive. You can see in this hive, I've moved all the frames kind of so that I can stick those new, the frames from the nuke into the 10 frame equipment here. So I'd give them a little puff of smoke maybe, and I'd carefully take them out. And I'd keep the same orientation. Obviously wouldn't be moving this fast.
Bees don't like fast movement.
Yeah, bees don't like fast movement, right? So that's it. There's your 10 frames. And this is called a Langstroth hive. What was it? 1851, Lorenzo Langstroth developed this 10 frame hive. And it's probably one of the most common beehives right now for beekeepers to work with. There are other hives out there, horizontal hives, where hives? I don't know. There's lots of hives. So, but this is the most common. So at the hive entrance, we have a entrance reducer. So in cooler weather, you probably want to have that small opening. And then at this time of year, you get rid of it because you need ventilation. Hives need lots of ventilation. So once that hive starts to grow, and we get about, I'd say 8 or 9 of these frames are getting full of all those life stages of the bees, we add a second box right on top of that. And again, there's going to be some honey in here, but a lot of the stuff in here is going to be the life cycle of the honeybee. Then, when we want to make the honey, we have what we call a medium box or a super. Those are interchangeable terms. And this is a big debate on beekeepers too. This thing is a queen excluder, so we put that right here on top of this box, and that allows the worker bees to come up and travel through and enter all the boxes above, but it keeps the queen out and continues the life stages down below.
So what's the big debate, Brian?
So the big debate is a lot of beekeepers will tell you that this isn't a queen excluder, it's a honey excluder, and that some of the bees are reluctant to travel up through it. It also can get kind of gummed up. I like the plastic ones, they're cheaper, and I find the metal ones kind of gummed up a little more. But again, just personal preference. I suppose if you had 1 or 2 hives and you're checking on them every 10 days, which again is kind of what I do when there's not a honey flow on, you could get away without using these. But yeah, it's a matter of opinion. The old saying is, you ask 10 different beekeepers the same question, you're going to get 10 different answers.
And as a new beekeeper, I'm finding that out. Yes.
So these are honey supers. Again, still 10 frames, a little bit more smaller size. These are 6 5/8 of an inch. These boxes are. Now, when these boxes are full, these things can weigh, I believe, like 40 to 60 pounds. This box. These boxes here, if they were full, you're looking at like 80 or 90 pounds. And so the other thing you can do if you don't want to lift that heavy weight is if you look at that little small hive over there in the corner, the Spartan hive, that's an 8 frame. So that cuts down some of the weight. You can also do 5 frame beekeeping. Bees just need a dry and hollow cavity to live in. They don't really care. In their minds, when they're in the hive, they're still in the cavity of a tree. So that's it. And then what you would want to do at that point, this is your inner cover. Stack that on. Getting a little sloppy here. And then a telescoping cover. And I apologize, I do not have one, but you can see the metal ones over there on the beehives. So that's just kind of the basic configuration here in Michigan. 2 deep bodies, and then adding honey supers on afterwards. I've seen some hives this tall. You can just keep adding boxes. You might need a ladder, but you can keep adding boxes. So that's how that goes. Jade, are there any questions so far? I hope I'm not moving too fast. I hope I'm making sense.
There are not. I have a few questions to kick it off if you're interested in answering them now. Or
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Say that again.
there are none yet, but I have a few
And I'll save plenty of time at the end.
questions. Okay, that's fine.
So there's the configuration of the beehives. Let's see here. So what you have to do when you think about honeybees is you have to think about the honeybee colony is a superorganism, and it's a caste system. You have different castes. Jay, do you have that picture I sent you of the different caste of honeybees that maybe you could pull up on
Yes,
the screen?
hold on. I will pull it up right now.
Okay. Yeah. There. Jade's going to pull up the picture. I'll just keep talking for time's sake here. So, one thing maybe people do or don't realize is that a honeybee. Oh no, the other one. I'm sorry. We'll get to that one next. A honeybee only lives for 6 weeks. The average worker only lives for 6 weeks. So that superorganism, that colony, has to continually reproduce. And there's 3 different castes. There's the queen, which for our purposes, we're going to say there's only 1 per colony. And then the other 90-something% are female worker bees. Their ovaries are suppressed because of the pheromone of the queen. So they won't lay the eggs, but they're the ones that do all the hard work. And then you have the males, or the drones. Is that centered? Can we see that? Yeah, so the drones are a little bit bigger than the female workers. I believe that's the top picture you're looking at. They're about 1.5 centimeters in length. The queen herself is about 2 centimeters, and then the worker bee is 1
that's
centimeter.
the queen in the middle.
And I hope that when we get into the hives here in a minute, you guys can see the difference between those bees. But back to the caste system, the male bees, they're there just to eat and reproduce. That's what those males do.
Freeloaders.
They're freeloaders, but they do have an important part of the colony. So again, the honeybee colony is a superorganism. There is a caste system. They all work together, and they all work very well together. I think we could probably learn a lot from honeybees. So that's the caste system. One other thing to mention too, if you look at the hives here in the yard, is your orientation. So if you're somebody who wants to get into beekeeping, the old saying is face your hives in a southern direction. Mine are facing south and east. You see a lot of hives that have painted boxes. Oh, I don't think I'm in the picture here. Oh, okay. There we go. A lot of hives have different painted boxes. Bees will actually see on the ultraviolet spectrum. I don't believe they see the color red, but they can notice the difference of shades of color, and that helps with their orientation to their hives. So if you have a lot of hives that are side by side, it'll help with that orientation, because bees will drift. I read a study somewhere where somebody got the idea to chalk up some honeybees with some chalk, and they set hives literally like yards from the original hive, and then 2 miles from the original hive, and they were seeing pretty close drifting in both of those hives. So it is worth mentioning that honeybees will travel within a 3-mile radius, and they will drift. They may go over to your neighbors and drift there if they have hives. And a lot of that depends on the time of year. If it's this time of year, like right now, and there's a heavy nectar flow on and there's pollen coming in, the other bees, the guard bees, really don't care. They're like, hey, come on in, bring your stuff. So.
About 20 to 6. It's about 20 minutes to 6.
Okay, perfect. And there's a timer on that. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to mention too. Well, you know what? We'll get back. We'll get back to that in a minute. Let's get into the hives now.
Sure.
It's a little bit overcast. It's not too sunny. Let's get into the hives. So if you want to train or move this over here, this is our smoker. And what does the smoker do? It actually suppresses the alarm pheromone in the beehive. So it kind of calms them down. So that is important this time of year, and most times of the year. And what I use for smoker fuel is any natural kind of fuel. I chose pine needles. I'll start a fire in there. I'll leave it loosely packed. Let's hope this thing keeps going.
Yeah.
These are the bellows. So that's puffing air. Now, when you smoke the bees, you don't want a hot smoke, because that'll just agitate them. You want a little bit of a cooler smoke. See, that wouldn't be any good right there. So at the top layer, I'm just packing those pine needles in there. So you want that nice, cool smoke. And there you go. Now, hopefully that stays.
Your lid isn't closed all the way, Ryan.
No. I have to pretend like I know what I'm doing here.
Now, Ryan, what is hot smoke versus cool smoke.
Yep. So if you were to have just a little amount of fuel in there and it was cherry red, and you'll see when it's hot on these smokers, it'll actually shoot flames out of the nozzle portion here, the opening. And that's what you don't want. You want to have a good hot base and then really pack your stuff in there. Whether it's, again, natural materials, wood chips. You can, if you don't want to get pine needles, you can go to like Tractor Supply and get the wide flake pine shavings.
I use pine shavings.
Pine shavings, yeah, or sticks, or
straw. We have some dry straw that works.
Yeah, dried leaves. Can you guys see me here? We're still puffing away. I'm taking up smoking. But it's important, again, especially for a new beekeeper or even an inexperienced beekeeper. You're going to get stung a lot less if you do that right. So I hope that answers the question. Okay, so again, the sun helmet I have on here. So I got to move this way. Can you see me? Can you see me now? Okay. So this is the sun helmet. In hot weather like this, I just use a veil. I'm going to tie this on. I think I'm still in the picture. You still got me now. Can you train in a little closer? Let's see.
Yeah, I actually can see the film, what we're doing on my camera. Oh, yeah, I have it on. I had some of my hearing aids.
Oh.
There's a slight delay.
It's just everything I'm seeing on the screen, I'm like sideways. Or...
No, you're fine.
Okay.
You're fine. I'm looking at it. I'm looking at it on my phone. It's fine.
So I've tied up my veil here tight. And now I think I could probably safely get in the hives. Best time of the day to do hive inspections is usually around mid-afternoon, 12, 1 o'clock. A lot of those field bees that are out foraging will be gone, but it can get hot. So here I am in shorts, in a t-shirt, and my veil. Let me grab my hive tool here, and we're going to go open up a couple hives. The other thing is I recommend if you're a first year or second year beekeeper, get yourself a good suit. Look for maybe a ventilated suit and maybe a good pair of gloves. If you don't want to use gloves, you can use latex or nitro gloves and just double up on them, and you can do that way too. But again, if you want to be frugal and you don't want to buy all that equipment, you could do a helmet veil, maybe a long sleeve white shirt. And why do beekeepers wear white? Well, nature's predators are usually dark colored. Things that are going to get into a beehive in nature are going to be like a black bear, maybe badger or skunks. So that's why you don't see a lot of beekeepers wearing dark colored clothing. I heard somebody say they wore some like dark colored wool socks out in the bee yard, and the bees tried to staple the socks to their ankles. They didn't like that material. So, well, let's go ahead and get into a hive here. I'm going to check out this little one.
Okay.
So when I'm working a hive, I always stand at the side or behind. You don't really want to stand in the front because that's where their flight paths are. Can you get this? Okay.
Yep. I just wanted to get to the back, so I wasn't blocking
Yeah,
it in the sting.
So you give a little puff of smoke around the hive. Bees don't like vibration, so we don't try to rattle things around too much. I'm going to go ahead and lift the hive cover off here. So there's your telescoping hive cover that I wasn't able to show earlier, but that's what that is. Here's your inner cover. You can see there's already a lot of bees above that inner cover. And this actually is a very small colony that I made up a split. I had a hive that was in the process of swarming, and so I made up a split, and that will repopulate part of my bee yard. There we go. So pretty much all of the bees that are on this inner cover right here, those are worker bees. About 1 centimeter in length. They will make up 90-something% of the hive. And those are the workers. Now at different stages of their life cycle, in that 6 weeks, they'll have many different jobs. From a nurse bee, cleaning out the cells, in the honeycomb for new eggs and brood, to a forager bee, to a guard bee. There's actually, at certain times of their life, there are bees that actually are meant to guard the hive. Oh, it's getting hot here already. So there you go. So I'm just going to carefully set that aside. Now, one useful tool I have here, this is a frame hanger. I thought that was pretty cool. So as I pull frames out, I can just hang them off the side of the hive. During hive inspections, I work from the outside in, usually left to right, just like reading a book. I like to start with the second frame in because you're less likely to damage your corners here on your woodenware. So we're just going to pull one. This looks like a blank frame here. They're starting to draw some wax on it. Here, I just got done telling about the frame hanger and I wanted to set it down on the ground.
We were just talking about getting one of those.
Yeah. Okay, so here is a beautiful frame of freshly drawn honeycomb wax. And you can see up in this top corner here, hopefully we're not too close, this is sealed honey. So in this stage, it's nectar. It's wet. It's not sealed yet. And that's your sealed honey. And when it comes time to harvest that, you pretty much want your whole entire frame to be capped and waxed over and covered. And right here, if I set this down, right here are drones. These are the larger bees.
And drones can't sting.
Drones can't sting. That's why you saw me pick that one up. And now he's flying up. So pretty cool. Something I never learned until my second year, I guess, in beekeeping. Drones don't sting, so you can pick them up and impress your friends. Hey, look at this. I got a bee in my hand. So yeah, so there's a nice start of a honey frame. And I want to see if I can get in here and find the queen. And Val will tell you that's pretty challenging.
Oh my gosh. Queens and eggs for new beekeepers.
Yeah.
Are challenging.
It's like a bad game of Where's Waldo.
They actually make a book that's like a Where's Waldo book for finding queens.
All right. So what do we have here? So we have some capped brood. And that is actually, Jade, I should have had you bring up that other. Oh, there's the queen right there. She came out.
Yep.
See her?
Wait, is that the drone down
No,
there?
she's right here. I'll point her out.
Oh, I was looking at the wrong spot.
So there's your queen. She's a little bit of a smaller one, but that's the queen.
Ryan is amazing at finding queens.
Yep. So the difference between the queen, again, she's about 2 centimeters in length. This one's a little smaller. She has a longer abdomen. Yeah, you got her. Yep. But again, you'll see this is a nice brood arch here, and that's what they do is they'll make all of their life stages happen down in here. It kind of looks like kick cereal, maybe. I don't know. And then you have the honey stored up here.
Well,
So
drone combing definitely looks like
it does. It does. I'm surprised they found the queen that fast. She's kind of camera
that
shy.
was impressive, Ryan.
Yeah.
Did you tell her to be ready?
Yeah, I said, "Get ready. Coming for invading your space." So we'll just take a look at a few more of these other frames. How are we doing on time?
The time is 10 to 6, or about 8 to 6.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Oh, we got some beard thing going on there.
So there's a ton of drones in that one. See that? These are all drones right
all those
here.
great big bees.
Yeah. But you notice I used a little smoke. I'm moving slow, and they're not bothering me at all. Every once in a while I'll get a sting on the hand or the arm. There are, as I said, that one was crawling up my ankle. Oh, it's a drone. No worries. But as long as you go slow and don't rattle things around, usually they're pretty friendly. There are some. There are just going to be some hives that get a little more agitated. Now look at this guy. He's climbing my leg. Look at that. And that's a drone. Not going to sting me. Just tickle my leg as he climbs up. Get back in there. But what I do want to talk about, and I guess I did skip over, is the whole life cycle of a honeybee. It takes 21 days from the time an egg is laid until a worker bee
There's a
hatches
drone.
out. Oh, look at
the
that.
top.
That's a queen cell. Right
Oh, you got a swarm cell there.
there. Yeah. Let's take a look at that. So this right here, it looks like a peanut. And that's a queen cell. That's how they make new queens. So maybe they didn't think this current queen was up to snuff and they're going to create their own.
And that's a hatched out cell, right?
No, it looks like it's actually active. You see the frosting on it, how
Oh,
it gets
okay.
white? They're paying attention to it. There's a worker bee in there right now.
Got it.
And inside there is royal jelly, and that's what they feed the queen. And that's the difference between the caste system. And going back to what I said, so a worker bee takes 21 days from the time the egg is laid to hatch out. A drone, 24 days. I have to remember my numbers here while I'm sweating. And a queen, 16 days. So when you know a lot of this information as a beekeeper, when you do a hive inspection, start pulling frames, that's how you know, yeah, this hive's in good shape, or I need to, jump in and do something. And you can't be too hands off. I mean, I think it's a good idea to get into the hives in the early season.
Ryan,
Days. Go ahead.
we have a question from Donna. She's asking, how do you know when they are going to split? And how do you do the split?
Sure. So we'll call this colony the parent colony. This is the original one. Bees need enough room, and that's what happens is if they get too crowded, then that queen pheromone is suppressed, and they run the likelihood of swarming. And that's what you just saw right there on the bottom of that frame. Now, this particular hive, they had plenty of room, but they just weren't drawing comb on some of those frames, and so, or maybe something was wrong with the queen, and so that's nature's way of reproducing, is to produce a swarm. And what happens in a swarm, the old queen and half of the bees from the colony will gorge themselves with honey, and they will leave that hive, and they'll hang out in a tree or a bush for anywhere a matter of minutes to maybe 2 or 3 days. And they'll send out their scout bees, and they're looking for a new cavity to call home. A hollow trunk of a tree. You hope it's not your house or your barn. And I've had that happen before in my barn, and I was able to get them out. So as a beekeeper, if you come in here and you see something like that, then you can manage. I don't like to use the word manipulate, but you can manage that situation and create a whole new colony. And by managing that, a lot of times I'll take the old queen out. So that's the X factor of the whole equation. I will take her out of that hive and give her resources and put her in another hive, and then let that parent hive or the original colony repopulate and do its thing. So I hope that answered the question. I'm sitting here moving my hand around the top of the hive that's uncovered, and I had a couple bees come up and check me out, but I'm good. So yeah, I hope that answered the question.
So, and he's careful to put the frames back in exactly the way they came out.
Yeah, and I don't know if you can see, I have these frames numbered, and I put the year in which I built these frames, and so that way I know in about 5 years I may want to go through and cull these frames, because a lot of the pesticides might build up in the wax. So it's just good practice for beekeepers a lot of times, and I'm sure your customers will appreciate it, to do things like that. So that's why you see some of the numbers here. So we did see the queen cell, so I'm going to have to dive back in here and figure out what I want to do. So this right now, this colony is taking up, I would say, about 5 frames. But they're not really building on these lighter colored frames yet. And sometimes as a beekeeper, you can checkerboard these and move them around, maybe to encourage them to do that a little more. So again, there are a lot of methods to beekeeping to help the bees. I don't like to say manipulate things, but to help the bees. All right.
What happens to the hives in the winter?
Yes. So in the winter, in Michigan, I don't know, October, November, they go semi-dormant. They form a big cluster. Think of like the size of a basketball. I guess it just depends on the colony size. And they beat their wings together to produce heat. And inside that cluster, I think it's around 94, 95 degrees. That's how they keep warm. And then on days, maybe January, February, if it's above 50 degrees, they'll come out and they'll do what they call cleansing flights. They hold onto their waist and they'll actually come out and do cleansing flights at that time. And it's good practice as a beekeeper like myself in the fall. When I get ready to harvest, you're going to want to leave around 50 to 70 pounds of honey for that colony to survive in Michigan winter. So you don't want to get too greedy when you harvest. So there's that balance. Were there any other questions so far? I could talk about this all day. Just ask my wife.
No more questions at the moment.
Her timer. Look at the red timer on that phone.
That what?
Oh, it says 56.
And I will post the link from Ryan's presentation in the comments afterwards.
Yeah. So I have one more quick thing. If we have time, it looks like we have about 3.5 minutes according to your timer. Is that okay?
Yes. We have another question. Donna is asking, why is some honey dark and why is some light?
That is a really, really good question. There are different, I guess, races of honeybees. There's Carnolian, Caucasian, Italian. What we have here, I guess, is Michigan mutts. I don't really have a breed specific. A lot of my colonies, I try to pride myself in either making my own splits or going to a swarm call or catching them. But again, there are different colors and types of honeybees, and not just the worker bees, the queens themselves.
Yeah, but she's talking about the honey.
Oh, the honey.
The honey from the flowers. It wasn't the honeybees. I'm reading her question on here. It's Donna Claire.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So the different honey, it's the nectar source. It could be from any different types of flower. People say a lot of times, I'm standing right in front of the hive. Let's come this way. A lot of times the goldenrod honey is a little bit darker and a little more sticky than the more clear honey that you'll see in the spring and the summer. And that's what I'm actually going to show you next is some of my extracting equipment and how I extract honey. So if we have 2 minutes, I think I can do that real quick. So come on over here.
And I've heard buckwheat honey is dark.
Yeah, buckwheat honey is very.
We planted some buckwheat for our bees.
So this thing is an extractor. This is an electric 4-frame extractor. And when it comes time to pull honey, again, we want to leave bees enough to get through the winter. So we selectively harvest. You take this heated uncapping knife and you're going to slide that along the frame. And as you saw earlier, your honey frame should be sealed with wax. So you're just scraping that top layer of wax off into a capping tub, which can be strained later. And then you place that frame right inside the extractor. This is a centrifuge. And you place it so that the honey is facing this way. And as it spins, it throws the honey out against the wall. And that's the centrifuge. So, I'm not a real big operation. I'll pull a few supers, get a sanitary environment to work with, and then start extracting. Put the honey frames in there, spin it. This is the gate at the bottom where it comes out. So that's where the honey will come out, and it comes right into a food grade 5-gallon bucket. I don't like to use micro strainers or anything. I just have this metal wire strainer here, and that'll just sift out some of the larger wax particles and any bee parts that maybe happen to be in that honey, any wings or legs. And that's your raw honey right there. It's not heated. It's great health food, high in amino acids. You want some of that pollen in there. And we didn't talk a lot about the products of beehives, but I had a honey thing in here with me. But here's a chunk of honeycomb. The wax, when it's left over, you can make nice little candles.
Are you still doing Marshall Farmers Market?
Yep, and I still do the farmers market from time to time. So yeah, that pretty much wraps things up. Again, I'm Ryan Mestdagh, Mestdagh's Honeybees.
Hey Ryan, how can people contact you for any more
Yep.
questions?
I don't know. Yep, I was just saying that. I don't know if there was a delay. Again, my name is Ryan Mestdagh at Mestdagh's Honeybees. I have my own Facebook page. If anybody is thinking about starting in beekeeping, I recommend read up some books, get in touch with a knowledgeable beekeeper, see if you can come to their yard. I always welcome new beekeepers and I love to talk about bees. Find a local bee club. You got the Battle Creek Bee Club. Kalamazoo has a wonderful bee club. And just find a mentor if that's something that you want to get into. It's a great hobby to have. And like I said, if you love being outdoors, you love to grow a big vegetable garden, like we see behind me, and have a lot of fruit trees, it's great. And they're just fascinating. They're fascinating to learn about and to watch.
All right. Thank you, Ryan and Val.
Yeah.
All right. Have a wonderful
All right. Thank you,
evening,
Jay.
guys.
Have a good night.